Welcome back to my Mental Health and Crime channel. My name is Hootie London. This is a case of the Idaho quadruple murders. This is for entertainment purpose only. This was an article that was written on the Air Mail. It's called The Eyes of a Killer. Baffled by the gruesome murder of 4 University of Idaho students, investigators put out a call for help. Thousands of tips poured in, as well as one very promising lead. Suppose you wanted to kill someone. Trigger warning. That would be easy. There are lots of ways. But suppose you wanted to kill 4 people, all in the same house, all within moments of one another, and you base to use a knife. That could help eliminate the noise, but it will require skills, strength, and endurance. Murder is band work, especially if people fight back. Then there's the real big obstacle. You want to get away with it. You're determined to stab 4 people living in a single home in the still of the night, and then disappear without leaving a clue to your identity. Now that's a more difficult challenge. But you did it. You have everybody stumped. It's a perfect crime. The real-life mystery that has enshrouded the pretty northern Idaho college town of Moscow, pronounced not like the Russian capital, but to rhyme with Costco, the locals with no attempt in irony, quickly reprimed newcomers. It had been a football Saturday in mid-November, the last home game of 2022, season for the University of Idaho Vandals. The Kibbe Dome packed with more than 7,600 fans, and despite the disappointing loss, Saturday night was still party night for college celebrated in knowledgeable polls as the best party school in the state. The stately row of wet frats, as they're known on the U of Idaho campus, twisting along Nez Perce Drive, was crowded with the brothers and their dates, high-spirited assemblies fueled by blaring music, prospects of mischief, and river of alcohol. The Hellenic Council, for reasons arcane and firmly sexist, forbids liquor to be served in sororities. Downtown Main Street was hopping too. The pool tables at Mingles and the metal sheet bar at the corner club were shoulder to shoulder with students and townies filling the brisk autumn night with. And then in the heavy quiet of the new Sunday morning, 4 young corpses, all students, all friends, were found hacked to death in their beds in a pale clapboard house, little more than a stone's throw away from the heart of university campus. There was so much blood. Trigger warning. It had seeped through the wooden floors and run down the building's grey concrete foundation in jagged red rivers. It wouldn't be until nearly 7 weeks later when an early morning raid by a police SWAT team thousands of miles away from the scene of the crime finally arrested a suspect. Brian Koberger, a 28-year-old doctoral candidate in a criminal justice and criminology department at Washington State University, was pulled from his parents' home in the rural Pocono Mountains of Pennsylvania and charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of felony burglary. And then in the heavy quiet of the new Sunday morning, 4 young cops, I just read it, all students, all friends, were found hacked to death in their beds in a pale clapboard house little more than a stone's thrown away from the heart of the university campus. There was so much blood it had seeped through the wooden floors and run the building's grey concrete foundation in jagged red rivers. Then I've read this part too. Let me go to the next page. I apologize. Yet even with the arrest, mysterious remain, neither reasons nor motives have been revealed that would explain the horror that ended 4 lives. May they rest in peace. And in the unhealed aftermath, there remains an armory of fears, 25,000 people in a once seemingly bucolic town nestled in the rolling snow-swept Idaho hills, still alert with suspicions. Neighbors seared by the mystery of 4 perplexing deaths, victims who have left their victimized too. Later, when it became necessary to fix blame for the entail confusion over the gravity of the situation, fingers in the Moscow Police Department pointed to the dispatcher. But the truth is the dispatcher was simply following procedures. All the town's 911 calls are routinely routed to Pullman, about 10 miles west in Washington State, and home to Washington State University. That's where, obviously, Brian Christopher Koberg is from, where they're handled by the civilian employees of a municipal agency called Whitcomb 911. The calls come in from the local Whitman and Ascertain counties as well as the city of Moscow. 2 universities with a total of about 42,000 students and 70 additional municipals and county agencies. And the dispatch crew's local newspapers report are severely understaffed. The overtime schedules often add up. To a grueling 20 hours each week. In fact, the Dispatchers Guild has complained that our ability to uphold public safety is at risk. And things only get worse on football weekends. Therefore, when the callers are agitated, rather than risk injuries, delays by probing for details, the responders swiftly assigned a generic explanation. Unconscious person is one of the standard catchphrases. It can mean precisely what it says, or it could be shorthand for something more ominous. It was 11:58 a.m. on Sunday, November 13, 2022, when the notifications of an unconscious person at a residence on 1122 King Road, Moscow, was passed on to Sergeant Shane Gunderson. Gunderson, who on the day was midway through a 12-hour shift that had started at 6 a.m., was running the operations division at the sparkling modernistic. It had opened barely 11 months earlier, Southview Avenue Police Headquarters. That is Mr. Shane Gunderson, who received the 911 dispatcher call saying that there was an unconscious person at 11:58 a.m. Prior to the moment, he told people his tour had been long and slow, a elongated weekend. Let me move to the next page since it's not clear here. Prior to the moment, he told people his tour had been long and slow, a languid weekend morning, punctuated by the chimes of the town's many church bells tolling solemnly in the wind. Yeah, it was a Sunday. In fact, he spent a good deal of the desk-bound Sunday mulling something other than police business. Gunderson had been avidly mapping out in his mind a strategy for the 8th hour or easily more. Trek to the summit of Mount Burrow. He and his friend from the University of Idaho Psych Department had been planning Sunday mulling something other than police business. Gunderson had been avidly mapping out in his mind a strategy for the 8th hour, easily more. Trek to the summit of Mount Burrow. He and a friend from the University of Idaho Psych Department had been planning for the spring. It's Idaho's highest point, and the trail up the southwest reach to the 12,662-foot summit is a steep, hard climb, and he'd admit after a beer or two it was just the sort of challenges he'd been missing lately. I don't understand why it's so important about hearing what Mr. Gunderson does in his free time. Now that he had had his Sergeant Stripes police work and more about disturbing memos and filing papers than getting out into the field. That bothered him. Nearly 10 years on the force, he still wanted to be gung-ho officer who had joined up straight out of Lewis Clark State College in nearby Lewiston and worked his way up from patrolman. In his early days, he'd distinguished himself as a hands-on cop, someone out in the streets doing what the Moscow PD calls community policing. Back then, he'd scored a lot of points both in and out of the department, as well as winning the Office of the Year honor in 2017, when he single-handedly planned and organized a hot dog barbecue bringing together the cops and the local school kids he was from the area growing up in. Back then, okay, we've read that. His childhood ones, okay. When the 911 came in, Gunderson had a corporal and 2 other officers on duty to assist with patrol. He could have left the response to them. He'd tell people with a hint of embarrassment, had no intimation or something out of the ordinary. The morning he was simply eager to break the monotone, and as always he felt strongly it was important for him to get out on the street, people could see him. He swiftly decided he'd go to the scene too with his officers. It was a quick trip. The roads leading into the university's neighborhood that Sunday were as empty as classrooms. And as soon as Gunderson's black and white cruiser pulled up behind the next row of cars parked in the driveway of the Austri cantilevered house on King's Road, he immediately knew something was very wrong. It was the noise. There wasn't any, just an eerie, unnatural silence. A cluster of young people, university students, presumably were milling outside the open front door of 1122 like gulls on a beach, and yet they were exceptionally quiet. They weren't merely subdued. They seemed stunned, as if they were drained by deep and intense shock. When the 3 mystified officers approached the front door, someone in the crowd, it would later be shared, muttered a single plaintive word: dead. Still, Gunderson would confess to others he was unprepared for the strong smell of blood that rose up in his nostrils the moment he walked inside. The coroner, who had once been an emergency room nurse in an earlier stage of her life, would describe the scene in press interviews as chaos. Lots of blood, trigger warning. Few others would even attempt to put it into words. So imagine if they smelled so much blood and there was so much chaos, how come the surviving roommates did not smell that blood? let's not forget, they slept at the house after DM allegedly saw the person who could have done these horrific crimes. She said she saw someone with a black mask, black clothing, bushy eyebrows, someone who told Xana allegedly. The reason I say allegedly is nobody knows, because this is all DM statements. She heard somebody telling Xana, it's all right, I'm here to help. So how come they didn't smell all this blood? Something is not right. There are moments cops will tell you that are too profound, too unnerving to be experienced in the present. All you can do is move forward. There will be time later to try to make sense of it all. Procedures take precedence. It allows a protective membrane to be stretched between the real and the too real. All other thoughts, all other feelings become extraneous. Trigger warning. There was so much blood, it had seeped through the wooden floors and run down the building's grey concrete foundation in jagged red rivulets. And so Gunderson and his two officers, largely mute, almost robotic in their movements, now stepped carefully across the blood-streaked wooden floor and proceeded to inspect a crime scene. Wedged against a hill, the house rose up on 3 distinct levels from a platform base-like. And so Gunderson and his two officers, largely mute, almost robotic in their movements, now stepped carefully across the blood-streaked wooden floor and proceeded to inspect a crime scene. Wedged against a hill, the house rose up on 3 distinct levels from a platform base like an Asian Persian ziggurat. The officers set out to inspect each floor. They moved cautiously, not knowing what they'll find. Yet, of course, by now they knew. The first floor, nevertheless, was a surprise. There were 2 bedrooms, and they anxiously entered each one. There was no sign of anything out of ordinary. Later, they would learn that the 2 university students, occupants Dylan Mortensen and Bethany Funk, had apparently slept obliviously through the carnage. It was an explanation that made no sense. Unless one's life had been informed by the experience of being a college student who curled up in a bed after a long night of drinking. I doubt, because the smell of the blood was too much. So even if they had a hangover, even if they were sleeping, it doesn't make any sense at all. And this was the first explanation of the roommates. I think, allegedly, this is my opinion, when they saw that it did not make sense, the police, something happened that the statements were changed. This is just my opinion. Everything is changed here. From a targeted attack, later on the police said, no, nothing was targeted. However, as the staging day wore on, Mortensen would reveal more about what had happened that night. She told the authorities she heard crying, opened her bedroom door and saw a man in black clothes and a mask walking past her, and bushy eyebrows, let's not forget. Frozen and in shock, she stood immobile as he headed towards a sliding glass door at the back of the house. And then, inexplicably, she returned to her room and locked her door till the morning. But now we are hearing that the roommates allegedly were texting each other. But in the daylight, things turned frantic. Mortensen and Funk first stirred from their beds sometime after 11 a.m. They found it impossible to rouse their roommates and call friends. Does that mean they touched their roommates? Because it's written here, they found it impossible to rouse their roommates and call friends for assistance. More like they call the Sigma boys for assistance. Those are not friends. And then in the torrents of confusions after the friends had arrived, Sigma Chi again, now friends have arrived, one of their. And then in the torrents of confusion after the friends had arrived, one of the cell phones was called to make the agitated 911 call that resulted in the unconscious person, message which was relayed to Gunderson. The trio of officers meanwhile proceeded with haste on the second floor. They opened the bedroom door to find two dead bodies, a male and a female. The pair were gruesomely drenched in blood, yet both their good-looking faces had oddly been preserved like masks. Strange. May they rest in peace. Even at that, the trio of officers meanwhile proceeded with haste to the second floor. They opened the bedroom door to find two dead bodies, a male and a female. The pair were gruesomely drenched in blood, yet both their good-looking faces had oddly been preserved like masks. Even at the probing moment, it was difficult. One of the young officers would later nearly wail to look at the 20-year-old pair. Xana Canodal, a grave sad-eyed beauty who was a Pi Pater Phi, and her happy-go-lucky, tously-haired Sigma Chi boyfriend, Ethan Chapin, a triplet from Conway, Idaho, whose surviving brother and sister also attend the university, and not consider the glow of the once rich promise that had been so viciously extinguished at her high school graduation in Post Falls, Idaho. Xana had confidently written on her motorboat. Xana had confidently written on a motorboat, "For the lives I will change." Poor girl. On the third floor, things got, if possible, worse. In one bedroom, lying in a single bed, were two inert women, Madison Morgan and Kaylee Congavs. May they rest in peace. They might have been sisters, so similar with the 21-year-old's pretty Barbie doll-like sculpture features, their long cascades of thick, streaked blonde hair falling down to their narrow shoulders. Yet in death there was one gruesome difference. Kaylee, it would be reported, had been hacked with a particular ferocity. It was as if her wild assailant, or was it assailants, had been intent on gouging out chunks of her flesh. Trigger warning, guys. Large punctures was how the lacerations had been described. Maddie's wounds, while no less fatal, appeared less feral, more measured, and least in comparison. Across the narrow hallway was one final door. The officers pulled it open, and at last they discovered a sign of life. A fluffy caramel-colored dog. It was Murphy, Kaylee's frisky. Across the narrow hallway, on one final door, the officers pulled it open, and at last they discovered a sign of life. A fluffy caramel-colored dog. It was Murphy's Kaylee's frisky labradoodle. He was unharmed, not marred by even a speck of blood, a small consolation, and barely one at that for all they had seen and were only beginning to process. Poor officers, I can imagine. A major case, and it was still the same long day of the frenzied moments and then hours that followed on that seemingly interminable Sunday. There is only so much that can be alterability, reported even Gunderson, and his team lost track of all the efforts in the hectic swell of events. Yet this Gunderson called his boss, Captain Roger Lanier, the head of the 24 Office Operation Division. He found him not unexpectedly for Sunday sitting down to lunch with his family. Lanier was a veteran cop. He had spent more than 20 years on the force in nearby Lewiston, before having been lured 6 years early to Moscow with the captain's rank after all these years. And it was still the same year. Okay, Gunderson quickly called his boss. We've read that. But quickly Lanier's professionalism took control. He had 1,000 questions, and yet he knew that only hope of finding answers would be to follow the previously established protocols. Dutifully, he gave the orders to set up the perimeters of the crime scene, to bring in the forensic team and summon the coroner. It was standard in a major case, and for homicide wasn't a major gate. What wasn't? To alert the Idaho State Police, and he did that too. Yeah, this was the captain. We've seen him before. I'll let you all read this. I'm getting a sore throat. Really apologize. The students needed to be warned at 2:07 p.m., a little over 2 hours after 3 cops had entered the blood-soaked house. The University Office of Public Safety and Security sent a vandal alert email to the students and faculties. Moscow PD investigating a homicide on King Road near campus. Suspect is not known at this time. Stay away from the area and shelter in place. A shelter-in-place order was requires people to take refuge in a room with no or few windows. At this point, busy hours had already quickly flown, but despite his marathon of activities, Lanier still had to succeed at completing one task. Was at the top of his mental list. He had now not been able to speak with his boss, James Fry. That's Chief Fry, the chief of police. The chief had been getting death threats. He'd counted 6 a virulent collection of unsigned letters and barking phone messages, emphatically promising he'd be killed. And those missives were in addition to the tall pile of rude and scatological, although less murderous, emails and notes had been received. The ostensible reason for these threats: he had ordered his officers to enforce the mayor and the city council's coronavirus restrictions. People had received summonses for not wearing masks in public, and at a definitely maskless prayer vigil in the city hall parking lot, several of the more reverent in the open-air assembly had been cuffed and hauled off on Fry's orders. His non-nonsense policy had made the chief a lot of enemies. Oh yeah, it was obviously basically was following the guidelines of the COVID. By the time Lanier had finally reached him, he was hours after the discovery of the bodies, and by the time Fry finally entered the home on Kings Road, it was dark outside according to several accounts, close to 6 p.m. For some abstruse reason, he thought it was important to go home first and change into his chief's uniform. Perhaps he hadn't fully grasped the magnitude of the disaster, or maybe after nearly 28 years at Moscow cop, he had felt the imprimatur of his uniform was integral to his ability of command. But what he saw that evening left him, he would confide to a friend, physically and emotionally drained. He was a father of 2 daughters who had attended the University of Idaho, and he had also graduated from the university nearly 3 decades earlier. It was impossible, he said, not to feel visceral tie to the victims and to their parents. Isn't it strange that the prosecutor Thompson, graduated from this university, Idaho University, and he went to Sigma Chi fraternity. The chief has graduated from this university. His daughters are still graduating from the university. It just shows you that there's a lot of people who have relations to this university. So this is an interest of, I would personally say it could be considered an interest of conflict. They should have got another higher team with more experience to have checked out this case. As soon as they entered a crime scene that is such a major crime scene that they're not used to, they should have called in the FBI straight away. But what he saw that evening left him. He would confide to a friend, physically and emotionally drained. He was a father of 2 daughters who had attended the University of Idaho, and he had also graduated from the university nearly 3 decades earlier. It was impossible, he said, not to feel a visceral tie to the victims and to their parents. The cruelty of the crime was deep and affecting, and yet he knew there was police work to be done. His mind was racing, but quixotically perhaps, within moments a buried memorial pushed itself forward. There was no way of knowing whether the killer or killers planned to strike again. The students needed to be warned. So this is the article by the Airmail. What is interesting is we know that, but it's been confirmed again that the place was leaking of blood. The smell of the blood that was so strong was told by the officers. So for the 2 remaining surviving roommates, one of them is supposed to be a witness, but we remember clearly that the chief said that I didn't say they were witness, I just said they were there. There's so much conflicting statements with the witnesses, with Moscow Police Department, that it's hard to figure out what is what. But this clearly proves that the surviving roommates would have known, should have known, could have known that something was awfully wrong in the house. Let's not forget, we've heard that DM heard noise upstairs, and she opened the room and she told Kaylee and Maddie, "Keep it down, I'm trying to sleep." She saw a man with a black mask. She saw a man with black clothing. She saw a man with bushy eyebrows who was not supposed to be clearly in the house. What makes her open the door thrice, close it back? She heard whimper from Xana. She heard crying allegedly, or whimper from Xana's room. She heard a man telling Xana, "It's all right, I'm here to help." She heard all these red flags and she ignored it. If she froze, how come she was texting Bethany Funk, and how come Bethany Funk was texting her back? These 2 roommates need to answer what exactly they saw. These 4 victims deserve their justice. Please like, share and subscribe.